business or whatever. And really, to me, it's not even about Taoism because I don't really care about words. It's just about what works and what produces results. So let's see. Yeah, so we're going to understand key Taoist ideas for what they are. Simple, common sense. See the key differences between the Western approach and the Taoist approach. And one thing I'm going to try to do today is just talk from the Taoist perspective, rather than just say, like, kind of this faraway thing over here, but sort of just be a voice for that so you can see it in kind of a living way. So we'll look at the principles and major aims of meditation, martial arts, Qigong, and we'll see what Michael Jordan can teach us about Chinese medicine, and we'll see the Taoist way of success and fulfillment. So we kind of already went over that. And touched on this a little bit, is that Taoism is actually quite scientific in the natural sense. And it's not really a religion or a dogmatic paradigm, because that was kind of the tone that it had in the book, and kind of the tone that a lot of people give it. It's like, it's not really what it is, because it's more so a set of natural principles that we can apply to really any set of contexts, kind of like physics or chemistry or mathematics. It's just a set of principles that you can apply to all these different areas, and it works and it produces results. Whether that's like sending someone to the moon or fixing a car or a number of different other applications. So what makes this approach a little bit different is that it's more kind of artistic. Because if anyone here is an artist or a musician of any kind, there's this process where you're learning the craft, and you're very much caught up in the method. You're in the scales or the techniques or whatever. And there comes a certain point where you have to basically forget all of that and just cast it all aside and actually trust the natural reflexes of your body. Because if you're in a performance or you're playing live, you can't really be thinking about on this scale and this key, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, because you're going to miss everything that's going on around you, and what is coming out of you is going to be disharmonious with your natural environment. In the same way, Taoism says the same thing. If you're living your life constantly way out of touch with what's going on around you, what's going to come out is not really going to be harmonious with your environment. It's very similar to music and art in that way. So Taoism is scientific in the sense that it has been studying and is studying, well, what are the causes of human suffering? Not in necessarily like a savior heavy kind of way, but more so like, well, how are we wasting our resources and our energy? Because we fundamentally want to know, well, how can we make our lives easier? How can we live longer and be healthier? And how can we use our energy and life efficiently and effectively? And then how can we harmonize our thoughts and actions with the natural world? So does any of this sound really weird or like far out at this juncture? Like, do any of these questions seem like outlandish? To me, it just seems like, well, I want my life to be easier. I don't want to have to work harder than I need to, and I want to feel good and be healthy, so what do I need to do that? It's basically kind of the Taoist idea. But given that it's extremely old and they didn't have technologies like we do, they basically just observed what they had, which was the natural world. So that is really where they're basing these ideas. So some of the fundamental Taoist axioms or beliefs that we'll build on is really this big idea about trusting nature and trusting the body. And the importance of cultivating yin, and then unlearning to actually learn, and then being absent as a way of being present. So this idea of cultivating yin at first sounds kind of weird, but if we look at how we're conditioned in our culture, basically we have all of this energy and attention and resources invested in doing more faster, doing more longer, harder. We have substances that help us do all these things. Our whole paradigm in structure rewards people for the more they do and the better they do it, they get rewards. So we have all this energy focused on, let's say, the positive side or the yang side. We don't really focus on yin. We don't really focus on, well, how do I be more calm? How do I be more relaxed? How do I sleep and rest better? How do I deal with stress in a way that it doesn't bother me so that I can handle more later? All we think about is, well, I'm tired, I don't have time to be tired, I'm going to drink this, I'm going to stay up late, and I'm just going to really get caught up in a big stress cycle. And then this whole thing about unlearning to actually learn and being absent as a way of being present, this really ties into what we're talking about with Wu Wei, or this thing about non-action, or effortless action, or whatever. which oftentimes seems like a challenging idea. And it's fundamentally because of we don't really know how to cultivate yin. And it's not in a sense like you must do it because it's good for you. It's more so in the sense that, well, here is a human tendency. We have this tendency that we just want to go and do all the time. Well, you need to balance that out. Well, you need to balance it out how? By learning to cultivate yin. So going a little bit deeper, this idea in Taoism that health comes from harmonizing with and embodying our true nature, and disease arises when we do not honor these things. And this can manifest on the physical level, which a lot of us can't identify with, but Taoism takes it further and applies it to the mental, emotional level, the spiritual level, and really living a life that is authentic and correct for us. And Taoism, in a lot of ways, has an idea that a lot of disease is psychosomatic. And from a lot of the practitioners and people I've talked to, they really believe that a lot, that basically we make ourselves sick most of the time based on the ways in which we approach the world. And then I have some doctor friends and people that I've talked to, and they're basically like, yeah, 60 to 70% of things that people come in for, if we don't do anything, they'll probably just take care of themselves. Which relates to this idea about harmonizing with nature and honoring what's natural, but is also very challenging because we want to do, we want to control, we want to get rid of it now. So really, Taoism examines the ways in which we are conditioned by the external world and how this causes us to ignore our own internal guidance. And I'm sure we've all had this experience where we're faced with a decision, we're faced with this or that, and we have this strong sense from our gut that is like, don't do that. But then our mind is like, well, but I should, or I must, or I feel guilty, or they'll be mad at me, and we make up all these reasons, and then we ignore our gut and go with our head. And then what usually happens is it ends far worse off than the thing we were trying to avoid. Or it really gets us engaged in a relationship that creates stress and tension and anxiety, because it wasn't really approached in a way that is authentic for us. It was approached just based on kind of an idea, and not really based on a way that is natural for our body. In the same way that, like, let's say you really have a craving for a food, you just wake up one day and you really want that food, but then your mind is like battling and saying whatever. Well, oftentimes the real signals from the body are important in carrying important messages, which we'll get into a bit later. And then here we just kind of threw in these quotes that really reiterate the point here. It says, when nature with its good instincts has been forgotten, artificial principles come as surrogates for this deficit. So basically, from the Taoist perspective, what this means is that once we've lost touch with our own internal guidance based on our conditioning by our external world or what our world told us we should be, then we start needing all of these other things to basically lean on or use them as surrogates. Which, if that's a little bit unclear now, will become more clear as we build upon this. So fundamentally, the major ideas that we can start to look at for the Taoist perspective is really ourself, and then how we relate to the world, and then how we believe the world to be. And we can think that in the same way as if you're playing in a musical group and you're playing a song that is not relating to the song that they're playing, there might be some discord or disharmony. Likewise, if you're approaching the world in a mental state that is not in accord or harmony with that world, there might be discord. So to the Taoists, they say, well, let's look at our identity of ourself, what we believe we are. As Westerners, we think, well, we are this independent thing, this independent, separate individual from people around us, from the world around us. Our mind is separate from our body, our spirit is different from our body, all of these kinds of ideas. And then we look at ownership. So much of our life is constructed upon, getting and doing more and getting more, and our life is based on, well, if you have this kind of house in this kind of neighborhood, you're this kind of person or this kind of car. And we have all of this stuff set up that is putting all of our self-esteem and energy in external things. And at first glance, that might seem like, oh, that's kind of weird, maybe that's callous, maybe that's a little like conspiracy theory. So then we have to ask, well, why does the suffering come up when that stuff is threatened? when we don't get the result that we want. And then thirdly, we look at our belief about the nature of space and time. You know, we look at this desk, we look at the world around us, and we think it's all static. We think basically the world is just this like kind of mechanical thing that's just like billiard balls bouncing off of each other, which the whole roots of our paradigm is Newtonian physics, Aristotelian logic, Euclidean logic, or Euclidean geometry, which is all very mechanical. It's all basically just billiard balls and very dumb, blind, mechanical things. But science is basically saying that, actually, I'm going to get ahead of myself. Save that one for the next slide. So this is the way we believe the world is. It's static and fixed. But the Taoists would say, wait, there is no independent self. You don't own anything, and you can't really own anything. And that our beliefs and ideas about space and time are actually illusions. So what do we mean by illusions? How is that true? Well, not an illusion in the sense of like, oh, that's wrong and you're a bad person, you must believe this. Illusion more so in the sense of it is a belief that is not in accord with reality or the context, and thus it creates discord. So if we want less discord or we want more harmony, then we might need a different idea. So the Taoists would ask, well, do our possessions and social status and authority, all these things that we stress and work really hard for and invest our energy in, do these things expend energy for us and stress for us, or do we do that for them? From that perspective, who really owns who and who is really working for who? In looking at our idea of reality, the Taoists would say that static and fixed are merely ideas which create suffering and illusion. And then basically modern science is saying that all things on the atomic level are constantly in flux, constantly moving, and that it's mostly empty space. If we look at quantum physics, any of the science that's come out in the last like 50 years, their science was basically baffled and had their mind blown by what they saw when they actually developed the instruments and started to see what was going on there. Because we had this idea about reality, oh, it's fixed, oh, it's solid. And then they got really deep down, like, actually, it's not. Actually, we were wrong. So this same idea can apply to ourselves. Because the person that walked into this class and sat down is not the person that is going to walk out. Basically, this experience will shift and alter you. If we took like some kind of photograph or measurement of all of your cells when you walked in, and then take the same measurement or photograph when you walk out, they're all going to be different. Because metabolism and transformation is happening all the time. It's just a matter of scale and perception. You know, some things we can see and perceive really easily. Other things are on a much longer curve, so we don't really see it because of the way our mind is set up to function. Because the way our brain functions, it's only really looking at maybe like 5 plus or minus a few variables at any given time that we're choosing to focus on. So it's all this unconscious data that we're just ignoring all the time. So then we'll look at the idea of the I and the self, and when does it really start? Does anyone have any idea when does your self really start? Good question to ask. Do you begin at birth? As soon as you come out of the womb? Is it when your head first pops out, or when your whole body's out? Do you begin at conception? Does the I begin at the sexual desire your parents felt? Or the moments your parents met? Or the sexual desire their parents felt? And we could just go on and on and on forever for all of these things that necessarily had to happen for you to be in the creation. And eventually, it would probably all go back to the Big Bang or whatever it is that we think came first based on our belief system. So from that understanding, how reliable and functional and useful is it to believe that we are a separate individual with a solid existence? Not in the sense that like, oh, if you believe this, you'll be saved and your life will be perfect. No, in the sense that, well, how much trouble and wasted resources might having the wrong view of things create? Because if our mind and our body are constantly at odds with each other, what might that cause? And if the human being is constantly at odds with himself and the natural world, will the result be positive or negative? These are just important things that the Taoists would look at and question. So now, we kind of have this baseline philosophical idea that we're going to take and apply to healing or medicine. Because basically Taoism, again, like we understood at the beginning, is really just a set of principles that you can take across a whole line of context. And honestly, we could sit here all day and do hours on medicine, hours on martial arts, hours on herbalism, hours on like nearly any subject that you can come up with, because it's basically just a framework that you put things in. So an important thing to keep in mind when looking at this is basically that we have a tendency to want to idealize things or imagine that like this perfect thing can exist. And if that sounds like a weird idea, look at the way celebrities and political figures and public figures are treated in our culture. On one minute, everyone loves them, and everyone's putting them on a pedestal through news and TV and internet and all these things. But then the second they show some sign of humanity, people are just trash them. And all that energy then goes into basically putting this person down and making their life miserable. Well, it's because when you put someone up on a pedestal, there's only one place for them to go. And at the end of the day, like we understood at the beginning, we're all just human beings. It doesn't matter if this person is a billionaire and they've achieved all of this stuff, or this person has no money and they've achieved nothing, or wherever in the spectrum. At the end of the day, we're all fundamentally the same. So the Taoist is basically looking at what is true based on those things. So from there, we have this tendency to want things to be all up but not down. We want the tendency to buy into the grass is always greener. And I really just point this out, maybe not necessarily for this context, but maybe for the context that I come from, wherein people like really get into this thing where it's like either or. They're like, oh, I hate Western medicine, I hate pharmaceuticals, I'm going to go do all this natural hippie stuff. And it's like, both points of view might have things that are useful, so you're really just limiting yourself. And then, like, also people will say, oh, Chinese medicine's amazing, I heard this acupuncture thing is great. And they go to someone and they do acupuncture, and they're like, well, it really wasn't that amazing. This acupuncture stuff's stupid. And they get away with it, or they just sort of put it down. But what we need to understand is that just because someone practices a modality doesn't mean they're necessarily proficient or effective with it, nor does it mean that they may really understand the roots of the paradigm. This could be true for a Western doctor, it could be true for a Chinese practitioner, it could be true for a plumber, a woodworker, it could be true for so many different things. But the thing is to the Taoists, we get blinded by ideas. We think, oh, they do this thing, so it's going to be perfect. But in reality, we need to actually be present and look at the situation and understand, well, what is that person really doing? What is the dynamic they are really bringing forward? So that's kind of just like most Chinese practitioners really miss the true essence of Taoism, in my opinion. So a way to understand that is the Michael Jordan high school dropout analogy. So whenever I grew up, Michael Jordan was my favorite basketball player, and the Bulls were like obviously the best team in the world. So I thought. So I was thinking like, well, so many people that talk about anything Eastern or foreign in our country, they don't really do it that well, in my experience. So I'm thinking like, well, what's the deal? What is that about? Because there's obviously some truth in this principle. So I'm like, well, what if Michael Jordan, at the peak of his career, went to some far remote place and was like, hey guys, I know you've never heard of basketball. Maybe you've heard of it a little bit. It's pretty amazing. Here's how to play. Here's how to be really good. So basically what would happen is those people that learned from him would learn skills and learn disciplines that were reflective of his level of understanding or mastery. But let's say I, for example, quit playing basketball when I was in like 8th or 9th grade. And let's say I went to a country and I was like, oh, this is basketball. This is a great sport. Here's why you need to play it. Here's how you play it. So in the same way, people are going to learn based on my level of understanding. And Michael Jordan's level of understanding is obviously a lot different than mine. In the same way, people come to America or translate books or write books from other countries or might be other ethnicities. And people say, oh my God, this person's Chinese. They must know what's going on. Or, oh, this person studied for 20 years. They must know what's going on. But in reality, it's always coming back to the understanding that person actually has. And I'm just saying that I guess more from my perspective, like studying martial arts, studying this kind of stuff, and realizing that basically Western people try to take the Chinese stuff and make it Western, and it just doesn't work. Kind of like that's why a lot of acupuncture in America is just really watered down. Which I'll tell you kind of a funny story about Chinese medicine, and that is that it didn't exist before the 1950s or 60s. It was just made up. It was completely just created. It didn't exist. communists were taking over China, and they were essentially atheists. And if you've studied history at all, you know they basically tried to get rid of anything at all old or natural in their country. Tons of people were killed, tons of people left. It was really a terrible situation. So, but they were like, oh, well, we need cheap health care for all these billions of people that we have. We need to create something that's scientific so we can export it to the world. So what they did is they created this little council and got all these people together and created traditional Chinese medicine. Because before that point, there was no such thing as traditional Chinese medicine. You went to one village or one family, they had their take on it. You went to another village, another family, they had their take on it. And people that I've known that have actually gone and studied in China have told me the most weird, ridiculous stories about some of the stuff that people do and how they all have all these different approaches, but they all work. And they contradict each other, but they both work. For example, acupuncture is the idea of you have an energy point, you put a needle in it, and it stimulates energy flow. Well, a lot of people believe you got to put it in really deep, otherwise you don't get the point, otherwise you don't get the energy flow. That's what everyone believes, and then they do it, and then it works. But then someone else comes along and says, actually, you just barely need to put it in. And then they do that, and then it works. But to the Western mind, they're like, oh, that's pseudoscience. That's the placebo effect. It doesn't work because it has to be A plus B equals C all the time, every consequence, in every context, otherwise it doesn't work. Well, that basically just takes all of the art, all of the humanity, all of the energetic, subtle aspects, and gets rid of them, which is essentially kind of what the communists did when they created traditional Chinese medicine. So then, being that a lot of Chinese are very money-oriented, they came to America and they're like, well, Americans have a lot of money. They really want to learn this Chinese stuff, so we're going to charge them like 150 grand or more just to go and learn our Chinese medicine. And that's what happens. I know a handful of people who have like $150,000 or more in debt because they went to acupuncture school. Just like, but they can go to China and to get the same, actually to get a far better education for like $5 grand. So.
See if I can restate what you're saying,
sure.
See if I'm getting it right.
Sure.
Are you saying that the traditional way of healing in Chinese culture, which generalize, is local and specific to particular instances? It's contextual,
yeah.
Right? But the idea that Chinese medicine was just made up is the idea that you can take that local knowledge and universalize it. Am I getting that right?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, basically they just try to take this living, breathing, artistic thing and make it formulaic.
Right.
Where you walk into an acupuncture office, you fill out a thing, they say, oh, you have headaches? Oh, here's what I do for headaches. Give you the treatment, and then you're done. Whereas to real practitioners, they would like want to vomit because that's, which as we'll see later, that doesn't make any sense at all because 10 people can have headaches for 10 different reasons. So it doesn't make any sense to give them the same treatment. Definitely not. And it's a huge parallel between like Chinese martial arts. Has anyone ever like studied Tai Chi or heard of Tai Chi at all? Well, there's fundamentally like 4 or 5 different styles. There's like Li, there's Sun, Wu, and Shen. Anyone know what that means? They're just family names. So they're all doing Tai Chi, but it's just a family. And it's basically, that was how their society and culture was set up. Everything was really big about the family and the tribe. So things were passed down from generation to generation through the family, and it wasn't necessarily passed on to outsiders. So that's kind of what I mean in the sense that it was like made up. But you were pretty right on with that. So comparing and contrasting 2 different approaches from kind of a simple way, we can just ask ourselves, well, what really sounds better? Doing something with an efficacy of 50+% or an efficacy of 5 to 15% or less. Now, when I'm talking about these things, it's a little bit challenging because we live in America and legally you can't say much about the medical system without going to jail. Which, does anyone remember like how you used to not be able to say anything bad about the church when you go to jail? Like remember Galileo? Kind of the same thing, but you didn't hear me say it. Anyways, so efficacy of 5 to 15%. If you just Google efficacy of pharmaceuticals, you'll see that in a lot more stuff. That is the percentage that they do what they actually are supposed to do. I mean, if you take this for a headache, it will actually do the headache. And then the efficacy of 50%, That is not necessarily statistical or double-blind study. That's just basically referencing practitioners that I know. And that's a really generous estimate because I know a lot of practitioners, their efficacy is like 90, 80, 90%, depending on the person, because obviously we each have to take responsibility. For example, if you just party all night and drink, you just get wasted every day and drink and basically eat terrible food, no practitioner can help you. So there are people like that who do this extreme thing that try to go to someone and fix me, save me, and then they try to do it and just create this weird thing. So it's kind of a generous estimate. So would we rather identify and work with the root cause, or attempt to treat a myriad of symptoms but never really identify or address the root cause? Would we rather use an inexpensive substance that has been used safely by humans for thousands of years with minimal to no side effects, or use an extremely expensive substance that is highly toxic with many known and unknown side effects? Now obviously, this stuff is not making any claims. This is just a Taoist opinion on this. Would we rather respect our unique nature and be treated as a human being by respecting what it is that makes you a human? And what we mean by that is, if you go see a practitioner, and this was kind of what we were touching on with the example of the localized medicine, is you would go sit with someone and spend a lot of time talking. A lot of time, the person would just be asking you questions and listening and watching and paying attention, not just saying, here, fill this out. Okay, this is what you got, this is what we're going to do. No, it's a much slower, more sensitive process. So this person can really use their skill set to understand what's going on with you. And in a little bit, we'll understand how that happens and how, as a Chinese practitioner, we might ask questions and see things and see what's going on with the person. So we'd rather run the risk of being worse off or have other problems caused by the treatment, or pay to be a test subject for untested and unknown methods. This is basically just a really common thing that happens when you go to doctors. They're like, hey, we have this new thing, it's untested. Do you want to pay a lot of money to use it? I've known people that have done it. And then would you view yourself as a purely mechanical, inhumane being and thus be treated in a purely mechanical way? And we'll talk about that in just a second and what I mean by that, because just on the surface it sounds a little callous. It sounds like, ooh, he's anti-this, and he's trying to just get us to do this like Chinese medicine stuff. But there's actually a pretty sound reasoning and basis for all the things I was saying. And it's kind of in the sense that history is sometimes funnier and crazier than you can believe or even make up. And one thing I'll mention is at the end I'm going to list some resources and like documentaries and websites where you can see where a lot of this stuff comes from and then go a lot deeper and see the actual like historical basis. Because based on the time constraints I can only say so much. So what do we mean by mechanical, and where does this mechanical worldview come from? Well, I learned about this actually like 3 weeks ago. I was watching this documentary, and it ended up being like perfect timing for this documentary, or for this talk. And basically, the psychologist David Rosenhan did this experiment in 1973. So up until that time, the psychiatric medical establishment in America had this really high status of elite, basically, rule in our country. No one really questioned. They kind of just did whatever they wanted. So this psychologist said, you know what? I don't really think they know what they're doing. I don't think they can tell a sane person from an insane person. So what he did is he devised this experiment where 8 normal people, including himself, would go to institutions around the country, and they would only tell one lie, but everything else about them would be entirely normal. And the only lie they would say is, yeah, sometimes I hear a voice in my head that says thud. And that was it. They didn't say, I hear it all the time. They said, yeah, sometimes. But they didn't tell any other lies, and they acted totally normal. Because remember, before that point, they were all normal people. So all of them were diagnosed as insane. And then 7 were diagnosed as schizophrenia. 1 was diagnosed with being bipolar, and all were given powerful drugs. And then, of course, when they're in there, they're basically saying, like, look, we're better, we're fine, I don't hear the voice anymore. And the doctors were like, of course you would say that. Yeah, you're crazy. So what they learned is that there was no way for them to do good or bad, because they were essentially in the quintessential double bind, where anything they did or said, there's like, yeah, that's what you would say. So the only way they could get out was to agree that, yes, the doctors were right, they were insane, and take all the drugs, even though they were totally fine. So their average stay ranged from 7 to 52 days. And the actual psychologist he like told his friends and family he was going to do it. He was like, yeah, I'll be back in a couple days. He was in there for like 2 months. he had no idea. So then he published his paper in the journal Science, and of course there was outrage, massive reaction across the whole industry. So the establishment responded and said, all right, whatever, you got us once, good for you. You know, we think you're kind of full of it. You know, we have a really tight ship going on here. We know what we can do. So we challenge you to do it again. They set a time frame to basically look, and he said he would send more people. So they said, all right, we're going to challenge you to send more patients. At the end of that month period, they came back and said, we got you fooled, we beat you down, we found 41 fakes. How many do you think that guy actually sent? 0. Man, that was so good. It was so impactful when I was watching that movie. It's hilarious. But anyway, so the uproar. What? The documentary is a 3-part series that was on the BBC. It's called The Trap. It's amazing. But I'm going to reference it at the end. There's 2 documentaries that will completely show you exactly how and why the world is the way it is today, and specifically, historically, how it got to be that way. Pretty good. So yeah, this of course undermined the power and control that this establishment had, and shattered the idea that they were this privileged elite that had specialized knowledge. So at that point, they were faced with a choice, because they had all this money, they had this big system going, and no human being is just going to be like, you beat me, and just like admit defeat and go into poverty. No, they're going to say, you know what, we need to figure something out. So instead they turned to this, what they call the objective purity of mathematical analysis, to diagnose and measure humans' intermental states, because they're like, we can't do it, we can't understand the human brain, but we develop systems to let computers do it, then it will work. And then coincidentally at the same time, they literally just invented ADD and OCD and all of these families of disorders. And they up front admitted that we don't know the causes of these things, but here's what they look like. We don't even know if they exist in the same way, in different people, or they're actually the same kinds of problems, but this is just what they look like. Go ahead.
And then that too goes to like disorders like autism and Alzheimer's don't exist because we don't know what causes them, and we don't know how to cure it, but we know that they're there because you can see it. You can see it Alzheimer's in patients, you can see autism in patients.
Yeah.
But then why do we don't know the cause? Because it's so complex.
Yeah, that's a kind of an extreme example, because that's obviously like really massively debilitating, whereas like honestly every human being has ADD. Like I mean, and especially worse now with like cell phones and technology, and our attention span is getting shorter and shorter. So like, now obviously some kids are hyperactive, some kids have issues, yeah. But we'll look at this, the fallacy of this whole approach in a minute, because it's not necessarily like these things don't exist. It's just the way in which it's gone about and the way in which it's approached is a fallacy and creates problems. But basically, it was just their way of re-engineering their way back into power and control. Go ahead.
So this is basically handicapping those not less fortunate, but less privileged, or not them, the unknown things. Because like I was studying that, and like you went from ADHD to ADD to now they try to come up with a whole nother DSM-5. And so what I'm finding out is that it all is within how that person within their area is taking things. So like you were saying with the cell phones, it's no such thing as anything when it comes down to mental. We all have mental issues.
Yeah.
So in my head, it just seems that it's a way to, like you said, trap or keep us secluded from us having self, what's the word?
Authority?
What would you say?
Authority? Or autonomy?
Yeah, authority, because I feel that when we go to these doctors, and like I never really took ADHD medicine because I always felt like the reason why they're telling me this is because I'm beyond who I am. So, but I know students, I know kids who feel that they can't do anything without the ADHD medicine.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm feeling like it is literally, like with the psychiatrists and stuff, it's a control aspect.
Yeah.
If I can control you taking this, then I control your money, and I control you smoking, I control you breathing.
Well, there's a couple things that we'll get to that will adequately explain your point and her point. Definitely watch the movie The Trap though. It's free on
You know,
YouTube.
Netflix?
It's on YouTube. You can watch it for free. But it basically, like the exact train of thought you're having, the whole three-part thing is kind of about that and about the history of it. So you'll probably find it pretty valuable.
So that's able to be on, I know this sounds stupid, because that's a lot of stuff we're able to see on documentaries that says lies, 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 and we keep moving forward. But how is it that licenses are still able to be issued in the sense this is what they're going by?
Yeah, we'll definitely we'll just
I'm gonna relax.
watch the movie and then we'll come back to some of these things later because we still have a bit to cover. I don't want to go too far off track. But as far as like autism and things like that, and even ADD, we'll see once we get into really the nitty-gritty of the Chinese perspective, how and why we can look at those things through a better lens and actually see what's going on. And actually getting to the next slide, we'll explain this more. So we'll come back to that point after this, because I want to explain the mechanical thing just a bit more about what we mean by that. So basically they just, in the 1970s, created this questionnaire system where you just answer yes, no to all these things. They put it in the computer comes back and says, yeah, you got X disorder. So then they went out in the 1970s and randomly interviewed hundreds of thousands of people, and then it came back and everyone was shocked. 50% or more of Americans suffered from some type of mental disorder. So then all of a sudden, millions of people who were previously normal were now labeled as living with mental disorders. And at the same time, it created and reinforced a fabricated idea about what is normal as a human experience and what is abnormal. So getting back to what we were just talking about, we can ask ourselves the question of how do you create a business to regain power and control? Has anyone ever seen an infomercial? We live in America, we've all seen infomercials. Well, this is the formula that infomercials use. Create a problem. Well, first, obviously, you're a person, you have a product, you have something you want to sell, and you're like, okay, how do we do it? You got to create a problem. And then you create something that makes people really aware of their problem. And then you have to tell them how bad it is. And then you say, you know what? Here's the solution. For only 3 easy payments from $19.95, call this number now. Act now, supplies are limited. Boom, done. And this is a tried and true formula that's used by organizations of all shapes and sizes. And if you want to build a successful business, you want to make money, just use this formula and I guarantee you will make money. Because it's just all human nature. And it's actually all scientific because there's a guy called Robert Cialdini who's a psychiatrist or a psychologist from some college, I don't remember, but he wrote a book called Persuasion based on all of his years of research. And it basically talks about how to be more persuasive in how people use it to influence other people. So basically this example just illustrates how fundamentally inhumane and mechanical the system is and the way of thinking can be. And what we mean is, how can you get more mechanical than being diagnosed by a computer and a piece of paper? So that's kind of what we mean by, like, would you rather have someone treat you as a human being, or just be like this mechanical thing of yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, you have this, period, end of story. So going further, we'll look at this idea of missing the roots for the leaves. Meaning we want to identify the root cause. Well, why does a person have this thing? Why do they behave in that way? What is the fundamental cause of discord that is making a person behave in a certain way? So we can ask ourselves, the first fundamental question that a Taoist would ask is, where does tension start in the body? Does anyone have a guess?
The mind.
It's a good guess.
First thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's a good guess. The Taoists would say that tension starts in the breath, the organs, and the pulses, which you can't really separate those things from the mind. So the mind is technically the body, so you were right either way. And this might sound weird, but basically our emotions, our feelings, our thoughts, our experiences instantaneously affect the operation and the rhythmic pulsations of all of our organs. I mean, that might sound weird, but if you think about it, what happens when you get anxious, or you get excited, or you get upset, or you experience fear? Your heart starts to beat really fast. So instantaneously, your whole chemistry is different because the rhythms and pulses of your organs is different. So in the same way, the body is kind of like a musical instrument. And we can define music as the organization of instruments playing rhythms and intervals in harmony. Well, we have all these different organs, and they're all pulsing at different rhythms. Sometimes they can pulse together and form music or harmony, and sometimes they can get out of rhythm and then produce disharmony. And in the same way, some rhythms are naturally harmonious and attractive, while others are naturally repelling and disharmonious. It's just kind of like, if I didn't know how to play drums and I walked in here with a drum set and started playing, everyone would probably get really annoyed and want to leave. Not because you're like, oh, your rhythm is way off. You need to practice this. No, because your body's going to be like, just want to get away from it. It's kind of like when you hear a song you don't like. You don't necessarily think, well, I don't like this song because of A, B, and C. You just think, ooh, get this away from me. In the same way, you hear something you like and it has this immediate instantaneous response on your body. And then also we can look at history and know that certain musical intervals have actually been illegal and banned at certain points in human history because of the effect they have on human consciousness. Because music originally, at least in our culture, came out of the church. And basically, the kings and the controlling families would hire and pay musicians to make songs that they wanted, which were usually used in the context of promoting their power or royalty or in the context of the church. Thus, intervals like minor second, minor third, or diminished fifth were all out, and people could only use major intervals because they're happy and they make people feel good. So in that same way, we can see that we don't have to know anything about music. If I had a piano, I could play music, and you would all probably unanimously agree, yeah, that one's a little off, or oh, that one feels better. So in the same way, the Taoist looks at the rhythms of the body, meaning reading the pulse, looking at the tongue, looking at a person's color in their face, or putting their hand on an organ and feeling what it's doing. Looking at all these things because that's really the root of the tree, because tension or blockage or stagnation or disease is starting first in the breath, which is then affecting the organs and affecting the rhythm of the body. So really, a highly skilled practitioner can look at just your pulses and tell you ridiculous amounts of information about your past, your present, and your future. And it's kind of a weird, freaky sensation. Like whenever I first experienced it, it kind of blew my mind. Now I put it in this context, it kind of makes sense. But I've seen people and they're like, oh, reading my pulse, they're like, yeah, you've really been eating a lot of this lately, haven't you? I'm like, yeah, how'd you know? Or you've been using this plant lately, this, what did he call it? Designer substance. I'm like, how'd you know? But I didn't tell him anything. I didn't say a word. I just walked in, laid down, and said, yeah. And then he could even tell, oh, you've been going to that other practitioner. It seems like he's been working on your liver, this and that. I'm like, yeah, how'd you know? But just because he can read and listen to the body. Which is what I was saying earlier about it being an art. About being really opposite of this mechanical mental thing. It's more so kind of like music. It's based on feel. It's based on inherent knowledge in the body. So again, the focus and aim of a Taoist practitioner is to restore balance and harmony to the organ systems of the body, or to rewrite the music and guide the orchestra to a song that feels better. That's fundamentally the major healing aim of Taoism, which is in stark contrast with the usual approach of only treating symptoms, which what we were touching on earlier is this fallacy of treating symptoms, because we have this huge idea in our culture that naming and identifying a group of symptoms as a thing, really what we need to look at is that naming and identifying a group of symptoms as a thing does not necessarily equate to understanding it or being able to deal with it efficiently or effectively. Because we have this bias of explanation where we think, oh, we gave it a label, we gave it a name, we know what it is, we understand it. And that goes into this idea we were talking about earlier about the nature of reality as being fixed and static. Well, ideas themselves are fixed and static, but reality is not. And it's always changing, it's always in flux. So to really understand something, you can't be blinded by the idea of it because you don't understand it, because you're missing the roots for the leaves in the branches. So for example, 10 people can have identical symptoms for 10 different reasons. So for that reason, how and why does it even make sense to give 10 of the same treatments? For example, a person could just have chronic headaches. And usually, like, for example, when I was in 7th or 8th grade, I used to get migraines, like, every day. And I would just, every day I'd go to school and get terrible headaches and just, like, pass out and go to sleep. And so my only option at that point was, well, we'll take you to the doctor. I went to the doctor. He was like, oh, here's this medication. Take it for your headaches. And it didn't do anything, and I still had headaches. But now I look back and realize, well, let's see, what did I have for breakfast every day? Pop-Tarts and Gatorade. Okay, maybe that's going to imbalance my blood sugar first thing in the morning. What time did I go to bed? 2 or 3 a.m. What time did I wake up? 7. Okay, maybe that's messed up. I hated school. It was boring. I was stressed about sports. I was stressed about relationships. All these other things that are contributing to the thing. But that approach didn't touch any of them or acknowledge or even ask about them. But now I can see, like, well, maybe I should have just gone to bed earlier. Maybe I should have actually eaten real food instead of Pop-Tarts every day. Like, maybe that was why I had headaches. Which I don't have headaches now. I don't do that stuff. But anyways, so headaches can be caused by stress, food allergies, magnesium deficiency, poor sleep, muscular tension, misalignment of the hips and neck, liver depression, blood sugar imbalance, lack of exercise, hating your job, hating your relationships. We could just sit up here all day and list reasons why you can have a headache. And that's one thing people don't really take into account is actually perhaps the alignment of their structural organism. Like maybe that causes problems. But we don't need, like, it's just amazing to me that it's not an option for people. Like, oh, I really have like a lot of, like carpal tunnel, for example. I used to have that. Terrible for like 2 years. Why did I have it? Because my posture was like this, and I sat at a computer all day. And then one day I met one of my friends who was a body worker, and he was like, oh, actually, just do this. And I was like, oh, my carpal tunnel went away. Amazing idea. I know other people, carpal tunnel surgery, boom, cut that thing open. Didn't really address this, so what happens? Still have the problem. It's just like, well, what is more simple and obvious? Oh man, your body is just jacked up. Maybe you should put it back in the right place. It's really not necessarily rocket science. So from that example, you might be able to see how ineffective it might be to simply give 10 people something to numb out their pain, something which most of the time has its own host of side effects and is likely expensive to obtain. So for example, if you have headaches because your neck is like this and your pelvis is like that, and your posture is really terrible, obviously I'm exaggerating, how is taking a pill going to fix this? It's not. It never will. And it doesn't matter if that pill is a drug or if it's an herbal product or if it's a Red Bull or anything. If your problem is your neck is jacked up, the only thing that's going to fix it is putting it back in the right place. So to a Taoist, it might not really be that effective because it never really identifies, acknowledges, or addresses the roots. And more importantly, it's denying a natural and useful response and message from the body that something is out of place. Something needs to be adjusted. Something needs to be changed. And even deeper than that is that it's inherently fighting the body. It's going against nature. Because remember, the Taoist wants to harmonize with nature. The Taoist wants to harmonize with the world around him. So if we're going to fight against it, well, that's probably going to cause stress, and it's probably going to waste resources, which is not really that effective or helpful. And the Taoist believes that the body, because it's natural, because it's connected to nature, is intelligent and can function when it's really given what it needs. Kind of like, if there's a fluctuation in the temperature, your body responds instantaneously. If you chew and swallow food, your body responds and digests it, and it requires no real know-how or knowledge from the mind. It's a natural process. So thus covering up symptoms can usually lead to pushing the problem deeper and deeper and creating a worse situation in the long term. And one thing I was thinking about the other day is like, is getting sick really getting sick? Because if you talk to people, oh, I'm getting something, everyone has like the same reaction. Oh, you want some Tylenol? Oh, you want some Advil? Oh, like here, do an antibiotic, do this, do that. Which that might be helpful, but is it really getting sick and is it really a problem? Well, because we look at what is sneezing, coughing, fever, or vomiting. It's the body basically trying to restore balance to itself. So if we're going to block that or suppress it or get in its way, it's likely going to end poorly in the long term. So another approach supporting it and harmonizing it may indeed be more constructive. Things like rest, relaxation, calm, herbal therapy, dietary adjustments, exercise, meditation, breathing, the list goes on. And that's really the principle we were talking about earlier about cultivating in. And these things are kind of in our culture, and they kind of used to be. You know, when you don't feel good, just lay down, rest, don't do anything, eat some chicken soup or whatever. And that's just kind of more of a natural thing. And even animals, if a wild animal or even people's dogs get sick, they don't eat, they don't do anything, they just lay around and rest and do nothing until, they feel better, and then get up and do things. It doesn't really require much of intervention. So then, as we touched on earlier, how can we start to see the roots? Instead of getting caught up in like, you have this thing and we got to do all this stuff, well, how would a Chinese practitioner or a Taoist practitioner start to see the real picture and see really what's going on? Honestly, we could probably spend 2 hours just on questions alone that we could ask, but here are some of the things. Because honestly, like, if I'm going to do a personal consultation with someone and they're talking to me and maybe they're like, like, honestly, I'll tell you this story. This one lady wanted to do a consultation with me because she was constipated. So she basically just paid me because she wanted me to say, just buy this like supplement and it will fix all of your problems. But I was like, well, actually, after listening to you and talking to you, here's why you have that problem on the psychological, behavioral level and how you're creating it for yourself. And she just didn't really want to hear it. And I learned like, that was a waste of time. But anyways, as a practitioner, these are the things you kind of look at, because it's in the same way, like if you're a musician, you listen, and you're listening for harmony or disharmony. Like if we say like, what's your sleep like? Just tell me about your sleep. You know, you ask kind of like vague, open-ended sort of questions, and then you start listening to what comes back. How it's being said, the tone of voice, how someone's posture changes, how their body responds. All these things will tell you, this might be an issue here. So we can ask any one of these different questions. And some of these make sense, some of these are obvious, and other things might be a little bit weird. Does anyone see a question on here that this doesn't seem like it belongs or would have anything to do with like health?
Grandparents.
Yeah.
I guess that'd be more for like family history though, kind of like stuff they may have passed away from.
Yeah, there's definitely elements of that as far as, for example, heart conditions or diabetes or, sort of hereditary things. On top of that, from a Taoist perspective, you would ask about, what was their life like? What was your relationship like to them? And really you're looking for the kind of dynamic or the energetic exchange between those two things, and kind of the tone that's coming about aside of that. Because like, for example, let's say your grandparents were really kind of negative and critical and judgmental. And then your parents took that on, and then you have that behavior. And then as a result, you kind of have liver conditions, you have headaches, you have dry eyes, you're irritable. And then you listen, you're like, this is just a pattern that's been passed down through your family. And then you say, okay, well, this is the behavioral pattern. Is there a organ or health correlation? Is there high blood pressure? Is there blood sugar imbalances? Is there hypertension? There is. Wait, maybe there's a connection here. Maybe there's a weakness of liver chi or liver energy that's running in the family. And you start to develop this whole picture, and you ask all these different questions from a different angle to see really the current that is there. And then you address that current. Not in a way where you're like, this current is evil, get rid of it. But you say, well, how can we just balance it out? How can we get back to a place of harmony? Yes?
The tendency hot and cold, what significance is that? Like, I know that some people can, I guess, like, but some people are just naturally, warm, and some people are naturally cold all the time. But is it supposed to, are you not supposed to be, like, one?
I mean, it's not necessarily good or bad. It just reveals, like, a bit of your constitution. So it's not necessarily a telltale, but in combination with everything else. Like, for example, you're really cold and you bruise easily. Okay, and you're a woman. Okay, maybe you're not building enough blood. And then you say, okay, well, what are your cycles like? What are all these other things? And you start to piece it together. So in and of itself, I mean, it's not necessarily good or bad or right or wrong, because like you said, everyone has their own little, preference.
Thank you.
So then we can ask, well, why does disease occur from a Taoist perspective? So the Western view is basically, well, we get sick because there's viruses, bacteria, pathogens, and mutations, and these are all evils that we need to get rid of. If we could get rid of them, the world would just be a better place, and we would all be healthy and live a long time. The Taoist says, well, actually, it's qi blockage or deficiency, or yin and yang are out of balance. And this idea of getting rid of bacteria and viruses is actually kind of absurd, because we would die if we did that, because we need all of these organisms, because the Taoist believes in harmony with nature. And on a scientific level, we are actually 10 times more bacteria than we are human cells. So if we kill all of bacteria, we're going to really undermine a huge aspect of who we are.
Do you think that some diseases that we just discovered have been around for millions of years, or some, I guess, pathogens, some of the bacteria, have been around forever, but we apparently just discovered them and so they're new?
I mean, the nature of viruses is really tricky and weird, and they can be really dormant for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden pop up and do things. So it's a huge thing. So in one sense, it's kind of yes and no, but it's a really huge thing that I think will require a bigger conversation. But the short answer is probably yes. Things have been around for a long time. So getting back to this, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get finished with what we have because we're running kind of short on time. So if we have any more questions, we'll try to wrap them up at the end. So for example, scientists are now using viruses to reproduce many materials and technologies like batteries. Saw this crazy documentary on PBS about this lady who's using viruses to reproduce batteries. It's ridiculous. And then we've evolved with many pathogens that have made us stronger and more capable as species. And even right now, we all have parasites living inside of us that are absolutely essential for our survival. So the idea that we just need to get rid of all this stuff because they're evil, it just doesn't work. So to the Taoists, it's not necessarily that these things are good or bad, right or wrong. It's just a question of balance, harmony, and context. And a question of keeping yourself healthy and strong so you can defend against whatever you need to. And then we kind of touched on how psychological and spiritual pain can be kind of a major cause of disease, because this really can be stored in our body. We have an experience, traumatic or otherwise, and we might consciously put it aside, but it's still going to be in our tissues. It's still going to be stored there, and it's going to manifest. Let's say if you have kidney issues, it's probably going to manifest around where your kidney meridian works, which is going to be like your low back or your knees and things like that. So, for example, people, let's say they have low back problems, knee problems, maybe they also have hormonal issues, maybe they also have reproductive issues. Well, why? Because it all relates to the kidneys. So, based on this idea of how and why disease occurs from a Taoist idea, fundamentally it's distrusting nature and distrusting the body, which causes us to really expend time and energy trying to control ourselves and other people in the external world around us. And Taoists would say, how many problems and how much suffering does this create? And basically, how many of the world's problems seem to be caused by trying to control and do good for other people. And if we wanted a fun thought experiment, we could look at all of the wars in human history and see how many were done because they were going to do good for other people, or they were going to save someone else. To the Taoist perspective is this whole idea of leave it alone and conserve your energy and use intelligence rather than force. But to us, we think, well, how are we going to get things done? We can't just let go. We can't be passive. We can't have non-action because, how will we know who's in control? How will we know when we're working hard? And it's really just because we're taught that to really do something means to be stressed and tense about it. If you're just really calm and stroll into I just made $1 million, and you're really relaxed about it, everyone's what a jerk. So lazy. But if you're stressed and your face is all red and you're yelling at everyone, I'm gonna make all this money, people are man, he's really working hard. Good for him. And if you think about it, and as a kid, we're in class, people are listen up. And what happens as a kid is you're all stressed and tense. And that's a really ineffective way to live. It's a really ineffective way to learn. Because the easiest way to learn is just to relax and not try to learn, but just be present, and then information just goes in. And if you want to learn at like a hyper speed, just basically get relaxed as possible and then take in information. And you will be surprised at how much better your recall will be. So fundamentally, this Taoist idea of letting go brings up our issues of faith and trust. And it's really kind of like living our lives in a way where we only want to inhale, but we never want to exhale. We only want to eat, but we don't want to eliminate. And this is why the Taoist is talking about we need to learn to cultivate yin. We need to learn to cultivate inaction. Not because it's good for us and because it's going to make our life better, but because it's a natural part of life. If you really want to inhale more deeply, you don't do it by trying to inhale deeply. You do it by exhaling more fully, and then what happens? You naturally let go, and your lungs naturally expand with no effort. But if you're like, you say to people, take a deep breath, everyone's like, then it just really creates more stress and tension. That's not really the direct approach. So the Taoist is really wanting us to use more intelligence rather than effort. And we look at our ideas of relaxation. In America, how we want to have fun, just relax. We worked hard, we need to go just relax and release some stress. Well, usually it's like TV or like beers with friends or partying or movies or sports. And really the Taoists would say about these things, well, if you claim they're relaxing, do they teach you a clear experiential skill set that allows you to sense, process, and release tension from the body and mind? Much like increasing your weight at the gym, do these activities allow you to experience progressively deeper and more effective states of relaxation? Do these activities provide you the tools to easily handle and deal with the stresses of living in a way that really diminishes their effects? And do they actually give you a surplus of peaceful, calm energy? So these are important questions to ask when we look at our ideas of relaxation. Because the Taoists would say, well, if they're not really answering those questions in a positive way, perhaps they're not really forms of rest, relaxation, or rejuvenation, but more so just recreation. And that's really where Taoist martial arts, meditation, and Qigong comes into play. Because they're really all kind of one and the same thing. Usually if you learn martial arts, you learn Qigong, you learn meditation, you learn healing all at the same time. And basically these things aren't necessarily magical or mystical. They're really fundamental ways of dealing with stress. Living is stressful. No matter if you're living now or whenever in history, we always have to deal with stress. Whether that's with our parents, what's expected of us, our society, our jobs, survival, whatever. The Taoist is interested in, well, how do we live a better life? How do we feel better? How do we have more energy? So these kinds of arts, whether martial arts or Qigong, help us to, have self-defense, be able to fight, but also to build health. And they teach us about our bodies and assist us in the process of releasing tension while also allowing us to cultivate various aspects of our character. So it's not just like, oh, we need to work out. I'm going to go do some Qigong and like pound some weights. No, it's like really developing and cultivating yourself, your being, so that you as a person are better in all the situations that you find yourself in. Which even in that self, that's a really deep, deep thing which can be explored for a long time. So aside from developing our character and these internal characteristics, it helps us develop a body awareness. So in the same way a musician can hear something and feel that it's harmonious and feel how it needs to be adjusted, we can respond to our life in that same way where something comes at us, we experience a situation, and we simultaneously feel and know how to respond in a way that is appropriate to that situation. So that our relationships can be better, we can relate to people better, we can make more money, we can get better jobs, we can be smarter, we can do all of these things. And this is why this can often open the door to insight, intuition, and intelligence. And all of these things help us become healthier on all levels of being while building useful skill sets that actually lead to having a more fulfilling life. So we made it to the end. Good job. No one's asleep yet. So from what we've talked about, you can see that it's not really necessarily that like mystical or weird. It's actually like pretty straightforward, and to me it's pretty obvious. It's like, well, yeah, I want to feel better. I don't really like feeling like crap, so how can I feel better in a way that's easy and makes sense? Now, what I was saying earlier about grass is always greener and wanting to make things perfect and wanting to like idealize things, it's not like you just like do a bit of qigong and like you're just an enlightened master. No, it takes work. Just like you wouldn't walk into the gym and be like, I'm gonna have six-pack abs when I walk out. No one would say that because people would be like, well, I'm gonna have to probably change my diet. It's gonna work. I'm gonna have to take time to do it. All these things. It's the same thing with building relaxation or peace or calm or any of these other important virtues and characteristics. So that was my major aim today, is hopefully like demystify some of this stuff and say some things that are hopefully a little bit thought-provoking and can lead you on to more productive trains of thought. And where to learn more, the trap I mentioned in that documentary, also a documentary called The Century of the Self. Both of those are for free on YouTube. They originally aired on the BBC and are basically just like scholarly theses that were turned into movies. And then my stuff, if you want to hear me talk more, Hyperion TV is one website, Hyperion Academy is another, and then my email if you have any questions or you want to tell me how boring this was, it's fine. So that is it. Sorry I had to rush a little bit at the end. We started to get squeezed on time, and I didn't want to